over. Now, every other day we get to hear that, some country or another is declaring that they're entering the second phase, they're entering the third phase of the pandemic. Now, but this does not mean that the world is just witnessing the coronavirus as it expands and perhaps becomes deadlier through mutation. A vaccine as an antidote to the COVID-19 virus has already emerged in the social landscape of many of our lives. Several countries are inoculating their citizens. So standing in the middle of all these, the pandemic, the cure, and all the conundrum around, in the 9th session of Corona Conversations, Mobility in a Post-COVID Future, we intend to grapple with several questions regarding the location of the virus and the location of the vaccine in our social and political lives at large. Consequently, to understand the role that science and technology plays in society, specifically during a pandemic, both in terms of providing medical support to contain the contagion and in relation to educating and actually providing vaccines to different categories of people, citizens, migrants, and so on, in a transparent and trustworthy manner, we have with us, well, none other than the most celebrated scholar on STS today, the founder and director of Harvard's STS program, Professor Sheila Jasanoff. So welcome to Corona Conversations, Professor Jasanoff. This is a sheer pleasure to have you with us this evening, and I'm particularly thankful you could join us because ever since I read your interview last April, where you made this really simple but a very profound statement that science will not come in a white horse with a solution. So this is exactly why we are here today, to understand what science and different medical and health contexts mean to different categories of people, especially in a pandemic situation, and how that informs a post-pandemic future. So in the light of this, we are really interested to hear you out, especially from the STS standpoint, as to what exactly the politics around public health sovereignty mean for us. But before we formally begin, I would quickly like to mention a few things regarding the session, as I usually do before every session. So today's session is going to be around 40 minutes of conversation between Professor Jasanoff and I, and then around 20 minutes of discussion in the open house. And the conversation is going to be recorded. The discussion will not be recorded. So, and all the conversations so far, there's a 9 sessions, and all our sessions are already, the content is available in our GSSC website for future reference. So please do not take pictures or record any portion of the conversation. It is going to be available open access in the GSSC website. Now, during the open house, you may press the Zoom raise your hand button and introduce yourself quickly and ask your question or share your comments. But in case of a technical glitch because of which you are unable to do so, please write the questions in the chat box and we will take them up. So this is largely the structural specifics regarding the session. And let us now formally begin with the conversation. So one of the most immediate ways that states usually adapt for tackling a pandemic is by imposing mobility restrictions on its citizens, by controlling borders to keep the outsiders away, by organizing quarantine facilities, ushering in systematic mechanisms for what we call lockdown. Now, this to me, at some level, is reminiscent of Foucault's idea of biopolitics and how state controls human bodies. But keeping Foucault aside, within the broader context of how bodies emerge as the locations of captivity, notwithstanding the observation that most of us make peace with this situation, my question is, can individuals, in your opinion, afford to choose, accept, or reject health protocols when the state objectifies their personhood as receivers of, and I'm quoting you here, beneficent power?
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you for the question. But before I begin answering any questions, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in these Corona conversations. It's really a pleasure to meet another community that is following, a very important dimension of the crisis that we're all moving through. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to take part in your series. So with regard to your question about individual power to resist the kind of captivity, you mentioned that word, that the state is subjecting us to. And my reaction to that question is obviously, as an STS scholar who thinks about these things from a particular point of view, I'm sure you know that Foucault's work on biopolitics has been quite seminal to STS understandings of knowledge in the world. But to some extent, the concerns in our field go beyond Foucault's concerns with power exercised over bodies. So in my field, we're interested in mobility as a much more general phenomenon, not constrained to the movement of physical bodies in space, but also, for instance, to the mobility of ideas and how they travel, and increasingly also the movement of non-humans in physical or ideational space as well. So from that point of view, I think the first question is to ask, well, who is feeling this captivity and in what sense? And you very rightly said, can the individual afford to escape the beneficent power? Well, to some degree, the power isn't beneficent. We mentioned right before we began this conversation that you were in Delhi, and in India, there's been one of the largest peacetime mobilizations of people moving from one place to another against their will. I mean, so there, the form of captivity actually took the form of mobilization, moving in huge numbers. The migrant workers in cities were forced, because of the lockdown, to move back to their home villages. And that has emerged as a lasting sort of humanitarian crisis, although the readings that people are putting on this, was it better for them to leave the infected sites and go back to the rural areas that were less infected, or was the complete economic disruption of their lives the thing we should be caring about? To some extent, that is a sort of debate that has not been replicated exactly as such in the West. But it's worth pointing out that in the West too, the question of who gets to move and who doesn't is very much tied to economic and social status. Only ironically, well, maybe not so ironically, the movement, the enforced movement in America in particular, but I think this is replicated in Europe, has been among the categories of people called essential workers, healthcare workers, and so forth. So it's people like me who instantly can turn their entire professional lives digital. I mean, it took a week or 10 days. It's just almost literally 1 year ago today. Tomorrow will be the 1 year anniversary that we were all required to go online, and our courses became online offerings, overnight almost. But we were able to transpose essentially the same things that we do, our intellectual lives, our professional lives, into the medium that causes your words and ideas to remain mobile, even though you're physically incapacitated. But clearly not everybody in a socioeconomic structure has the luxury of divorcing the work from the physical body. And when you look at public transportation, when you look at who is forced to get up and go to work, in America, for instance, meatpacking plants have emerged as a major site of COVID transmission. This is a reminder that the captivity of the quarantine, which so obsessed Foucault, maybe should have side by side with it the captivity of the non-quarantine, that is, who is not being allowed to, in a sense, reap the benefits of this beneficent power that you called attention to. In the comparative study that I have been immersed in and involved with for the last approximately 10 months, this has emerged as a site of comparison. That is, who moves, what moves, why did some things move? There was a case 0 or a case 1 of detected coronavirus incidents in Wuhan before we became subject to a global pandemic. And yet that virus was allowed to move out of China. And there are interesting dynamic maps of how that virus spread. In the meantime, China instituted, as is well known, one of the most powerful and effective lockdowns anywhere in the world, thereby containing the virus within China while it moved almost at free will around the rest of the world. So I think that, to sum up, one has to take this question of mobility. I mean, of course, in your program, you know this, that as a profoundly political question, a question of who moves and who does not, in response to what, even in emergencies, who is protected by immobility, as opposed to Foucault's governmentality, where it's not that you're protected by immobility, you're disciplined by immobility. But for people like me, the work of our minds did not get disciplined in the same way. And arguably, we've actually been doing more work as a result of not having to move across space. I mean, I can tell you that my email boxes are overflowing and crowded, showing no sign of stasis and it's undisciplined in a sense. So I think one has to keep this sort of yin-yang feature of mobility constantly in one's mind, especially in the digital environment in which we are all moving around today.
Right. Thank you very much. I mean, this really opens up another question for me to ask you, as you rightly pointed out, that who gets to move and who can afford to divorce work from the physical body. In this context, Zhang Biao came up with this term as immobility capital. That like several of us do not have to move, especially like those delivery people from Amazon and all other those e-commerce sectors which have gone into a boom since the pandemic came alive, emerged. So in terms of that, you don't really have to go out. You can just stay at home and everything has been delivered to you. So immobility is also capital, as against the people who are forced to move, as you talk about the Indians, the regional migrants within India. So on one hand, we have Foucault's governmentality, which kind of says that, like immobility disciplines us and is a problem, is dysfunctional. On the other hand, we also have reached a space of immobility as a capital. Now, how would you respond to this entire idea of immobility capital? And do you think that, it is actually something which is going to stay even beyond the pandemic situation?
So that's the last note you end on is an extremely interesting point to begin, because everybody's asking, will there be a new normal? If so, what will the new be and what will the normal be? And are we going to go back to the same place? Are we going to go back to a better place? If so, how? Or a worse place for that matter? And economists, as you know, are talking about the shape of the recovery. The K-shape in particular is a way of discussing the fact that for some people it'll be worse, and for some people it may be better, or at least a return to the status quo. So I think that for those of us who are in intellectual professions where capital, in a sense, is the flow of ideas, one form that this has taken is the immobility actually generating the potential for new forms of capital, in some sense, that whoever's in a position to create out of the forced immobilization new imaginative resources, such as who you reach and so on and so forth, gets to enjoy a sort of first mover advantage in the markets that are being opened up. I think the danger, though, of the term immobility capital is that it suggests, it focuses on the new, that immobility is the starting point for thinking about capital, whereas I think that the deeper sort of structural basis, the way in which capital already was organized, has enabled certain sectors, certain industries, certain individuals to benefit disproportionately from what this capital is all about. And, it's continually the glass half full, glass half empty. That reading suggests that for critics, it's always the half empty side that should be beckoning. That is, the what's going on. You mentioned Amazon, and that some people can afford to stay in their homes and everything will be delivered to them. But e-commerce is a profoundly misleading term, right? I mean, the things don't move by they move by actual bodies, delivering the goods and so, driving the trucks. There's fuel being used and cardboard. I mean, those midway through the pandemic, there was an article I saw about how cities were suddenly coping with huge amounts of trash because all these Amazon objects, they're coming in cardboard boxes and they need to be taken somewhere and recycled. And there's an environmental imprint out of that. And, I'm sure that there are bunches of environmental scientists doing the sort of cradle to grave assessments of what this seemingly frictionless e-commerce has actually meant in terms of imprint and sort of solid waste and things moving around the world. But people who had those infrastructures in place already were able to benefit from the necessary physical infrastructure on which this somewhat fictionalized digital structure moves. So it is not surprising to find that the wealth of the very same people who were being discussed in terms of inequality at Davos of the last 5 years, the indicator of inequality in the world has become how few people own enough resources to compensate for half of the world's population, right? I mean, it's become a kind of little measure. Is it 5 people this year? Is it 6 people or 7 people, or is it back to 5? Well, those 5 or 6 or 7 have benefited disproportionately. And again, I think that somehow immobility capital may distract us from, remembering the Marxian roots of capital, and that, it has a way of multiplying itself in certain senses. These very same people who have not been able to reap the benefits of capital are also the ones who don't have money invested in the stock market. In America, there's a respectable strain of critique that says, looking at how wonderfully the stock market is doing, it's just not a very good measure of how the society is doing, because look at what a small percentage of households actually have investments. And, if you take that, the stock market's performance, as a measure of immobility capital and talk about that, then you would be ignoring those people who don't have the capital and who therefore cannot, multiply it in this virtual medium of the stock market. So I always get a little bit worried about the ahistoricity of our own creative minds because we tend to see the emergent phenomenon and not the way in which the emergent phenomenon is tied to embedded phenomena, and whether it is a question. I mean, you and I both have Indian origins, and therefore we're used to ideas of cyclicity in time, right? I mean, not that Germany has been immune to Hegelian ideas either. I mean, so, but not linearity. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon idea is much more linearity, and things are always going up or down, but the time's arrow progresses in a certain way. And I think that that this fixation on what is being spawned in the moment tends to take our minds away from certain kinds of cyclicity that may be spiraling, may not be a circle coming around to the same endpoint, but it's also not divorced from the what has been already.
Right. A very interesting take on immobility capital, that it kind of dehistoricizes from the existing organization of an unequal distribution around the capitalist entire mode of production. Thank you for this insight. We will now get into something similar, but little shifting our conversation to another very interesting context of anti-mask movements. In this context of mobility and captivity and so on. In the first session of the series, we discussed quite a bit on the anti-mask movements in the US, then in Germany, especially in Berlin, how 20,000 people gathered and all these things. So, but almost exclusively, as far as I can see, this has been a phenomenon in the global north. Scattered resistance initiatives in different parts of global north, and I'm not even sure if we can call them as movements, in a very epistemic sense of the term, but the resistance against and disdain towards state-mandated health protocols during the outbreak of the pandemic. Now, it was visible, and several governments had, difficult time in terms of negotiating with those cases, those emergencies. Now, as the world is witnessing the second wave or the third wave, for example, Germany is still under lockdown. So this reimposing restrictions on mobility and social contacts, it kind of makes people in general exasperated. Now, located in the context of human agency versus institutional structures, how do you analyze this human tendency towards breaking out, despite the threat of a contagion?
Amrita, that's such a rich and multi-layered question that we could talk about this for several hours, but I will try to give some couple of quick reactions to this, because the particular playing out and parsing of the anti-mask mobilizations in this country, in the US, are so fascinating, and the comparison with Europe is also fascinating. So one of the first things I'll say is that whereas both in Germany and in the US, the anti-mask movement has been located in the non-establishment fringe, if you will. I mean, I won't say right or left, because those things don't necessarily mean that much. But in the comparative study we're doing, our Swedish colleagues said that originally, at least, it was the anti-migrant and right-wing, more like the AFD population of Sweden that favored the masks. And it was actually the liberal democratic ruling center that was disfavoring the masks and saying that there should be more interpretive flexibility, if you will, on the part of the population to decide, what they wanted to do with themselves. This whole question of what the stringency of a mask requirement ought to be and what its foundations are relates back, in my view, and in the view of the colleagues I've been working with different ideas of citizenship and the relationship of this term that you've already thrown out, that I like, public health sovereignty. The quarantine idea, as you already mentioned at the outset, is hundreds of years old, and lockdowns, and the idea that you suppress mobility in order to suppress the disease. I mean, that is by now ancient. But how do you do that? And most modern states have created pretty powerful public health entities. They don't usually lock us down for a year. I mean, that is truly an extraordinary intervention in global public life. But by and large, people are conditioned to accept that this is a phenomenon of life. I mean, people don't go up in arms and, engage in fights with their pediatricians most of the time if they're told that their child has to be inoculated against some things. And in America, the sort of constitutional jurisprudence around these issues was initially decided back at the turn of the 20th century. 1905 is the landmark Supreme Court decision on compulsory vaccination. So people are used to the idea that there is this, what I've called a state within a state, that there is a particular delegation. Again, if you're particularly familiar with Foucault, this is like, bread and butter to you, because you know that the state operates through these major delegated institutions, such as in the healthcare sector and the educational or the military. So people are used to some extent to being obedient. Now, the masking controversy is interesting because it runs counter to other presumptions of citizenship. So in at least France and to a lesser extent also in Germany, the appearance of the face, as you know, has been deemed coextensive with certain norms of citizenship, and hiding the face, particularly because for the last 30 or so years, especially since 9/11, if not sooner, the question of the Islamic other and its reception in the West has been so tied to whether you display the full extent of the face or not. And, so an imposition of masking on top of this sort of extant ideas about what is freedom and what is the state's expectation of a free people. How do you recognize people in your community? And how can you recognize them if you adopt masking? I mean, again, it's worth keeping in mind for the humanists in our eventual audience that masking is metaphoric as well. I mean, that is, putting on a mask is a hiding of true intent. And the word can't be divorced from these kinds of connotations, that somehow it is an artificial construct that puts a barrier between yourself and the acknowledgement and recognizability that are considered part of liberal society and its citizenship. Now, on top of that, the particular responses to masking, I believe, are closely linked to something that, if you forgive me for a second, that's related in my own work to the idea of civic epistemologies. That is, when sovereignty decrees itself in certain ways, says you must do thus and such. In democracies, we've grown used to the idea that reasons have to be given, explanations have to be given. Otherwise, you're in a tyranny if there's not an explanation. But then, as my own comparative work and other people's comparative work has also shown, the stylized ways in which people accept reason giving differ enormously from one place to another. And from an STS point of view, one place where this stylized differentiation displays itself is in the way in which people bring science and technology into their public reason, into their modes of reason giving. In the US, the one way in which we have created solidarity, or at least the possibility of difference and pluralism lodging inside the same polity, is to bump a lot of the political work into this thing called science. So, I think of it as a game board in which once you reach the box called science, you're in a safe place. Or you might think of it like a medieval sanctuary. Once you're in the church, nobody can attack you. Only the church now is science. So public health sovereignty in America supports itself by taking refuge in the sanctuary of science. And only in this country has the discourse of masking been completely identified with being pro and anti-science. So just very recently, the new president, Biden, got into a war of words with the governor of Texas, who has, as of this week, decided to open up his state because the states in the union have a lot of power to go their own ways. It's a little bit like the standoff between Bavaria and Berlin in Germany. So, Texas is the Bavaria of the US. I mean, it's not the same sort of, we go our own way and we have our own ethos and so on and so forth. But Joe Biden dismissed the governor's policies as Neanderthal. I mean, mind you, Neanderthal, I mean, we know where that comes from, and it's not meant to be used pejoratively if it's purely a biological term. But in any case, I mean, he was talking about how benighted this is. Benighted because anti-enlightenment and anti-science. So, this sort of clear identification of the public health sovereign's decree as being scientifically undergirded. And if you're denying it, you're in a sense an apostate. You're going against science. This is a particular recurrent feature of American civic epistemologies. And going back now to your question about why is it in the global north that we see these breakout phenomena and not in the global south, you would have to ask, what is the relationship, the three-cornered relationship between political sovereignty, scientific and expert sovereignty, and the citizen, and how has that been worked out? And I think that if you did that detailed work, the comparative work between an India and a US and a Germany, you would come out with very different orderings of those three corners of the modern political configuration. So with that, which only opens the way to more questions, let me hand it back to you.
Yes, it does. And I mean, it's fascinating that, like how you say that, public health sovereignty in America, finds refuge in science. Um, just, and as you point out in terms of India, sitting in India, in fact, from a very ontological standpoint, where I see my friends and my family, having to make a tough choice between the right to protest against the, mask protocol and the right to actually survive the pandemic. So how so do you, I mean, my question is like, do you think that, I mean, not to just say that this is a white privilege, it is a western privilege to allow dissenting, in terms of anti-mask movements, but where do you locate this entire dichotomy of, right to, a privacy, or right to express yourself in a democratic setup, and as against the right to health care and right to live and survive?
Thanks. I mean, anytime you get into a competing rights discourse, of course, the answer has to become, well, it depends. But I think it has to begin with the observation that I don't know any society in which any right is absolute. I mean, it's always in relation to something else. So the right to freedom of expression has never been absolute if the thing that you're expressing could endanger people. I mean, so when one learns First Amendment law in America, because the First Amendment is the piece of the Bill of Rights that grants the right to free expression, association, and belief, uh, the example that people always take is a kind of public health example. It's that you do not have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater, because if you did that and you were faking it, people would be trampled to death or would get injured and hurt. So it's a very crisp and quick way of saying that your freedom of expression, or any of these associated freedoms, the right to associate, the right to move freely, etc., that these can be constrained legitimately within the strictures of a democratic government if what you're doing will put others at risk. So the claim in America is not, I have a God-given right to move about as I please. It is also that, and you, by the way, you public health authorities, have not adequately and sufficiently explained to me why I must, obey your strictures. So just this morning, one of our major papers had an article saying that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in America, have just, under very great public pressure, issued some guidelines saying, if you're fully vaccinated and have waited the 2 weeks and you're fully immunized, you can associate with a small number of family and friends who are, still prudent. I mean, that is not in crowds and not parties. But now people are actually resisting this liberalization, this freedom from captivity, because they don't necessarily believe the agency, because they've said other things in the past. I mean, so people are reaching common sense credibility judgments and are actually inviting, in a sense, a greater degree of captivity than the government is willing to impose on them. So there are these sorts of, it's not obvious even that that the direction in which the sovereignty is being exercised is always the same thing, or that people will receive it in the same way. People are forming very much their own judgments about, I mean, reaching individual cost benefit analyses in a sense. And this is something that we know happens. I mean, we've known it at least since, to take the German context, Ulrich Risk Society book appeared, 25, no, sorry, it was mid 1980s, right, 1986-ish. That in an informed society, it's more the question, not how should the trade-off be resolved that you describe between freedom and constraint, but who do people think gets to make that judgment? And how credible, if this is a delegated dimension of sovereignty, is the sovereign still legitimate enough to be exercising that judgment on behalf of the people? And I think that we see sort of fraying consensus there. I mean, I remember, I believe, a little viral video of Mr. Modi turning down a mask as he was going past a vendor, and in a context where he had insisted that other people be wearing masks. I mean, so, you know, what was going on in the sort of 30-second clip of him, you know, sort of going like this to the man who was urging, I mean, he was in a public place. Other people around, shown in the video, were masked. But, you know, what was he asserting in that moment? I mean, these are kinds of little cultural phenomena that will have to be taken out and, you know, sort of analyzed in context. And I think it will emerge that this thing that I'm calling, you know, civic epistemologies will have some force in those contexts.
Right. Okay, thank you for this. And right now, we will stop focusing on the virus, but now little moving towards the vaccine. In the session with Peter van der Veer a couple of weeks back, we engaged with this entire idea and the possibility of, you know, not just vaccine nationalism, but vaccine imperialism. And given that, you know, different countries now accuse each other as to, you know, which virus strain is more dangerous, whether it's the UK virus strain more dangerous or South African virus strain more dangerous, and depending on which, you know, the mobility, international mobility is either being allowed or not. So from that standpoint, the first observation that I make as a sociologist is that, you know, each strain of the virus has a nationality. And the second observation is that, you know, if the first observation is a reality, then it is only historically logical that nationalism comes with the sentiments of imperialism, and hence virus strains can legitimately fight with each other and dominate over one another, you know, depending on access to resources. So now taking a step ahead, do we anticipate a future characterized by vaccine colonialism? And what kind of epoch in human history are we envisaging where a pandemic has ensured corporate gain at the altar of human suffering?
Yeah, again, a question with many dimensions. And I think that for the moment, because things have not played themselves out, it's worth just calling attention to what some of these dimensions are. So against this sort of backdrop of mobility and immobility, it's worth, first of all, noting as a baseline something that we all know, namely that vaccines are not as mobile as the viruses. I mean, that is, if you look at the total number of countries and the ones in which vaccination is already underway, it's something, what, on the order of a quarter of them. I mean, and it follows the wealth classification. I mean, poorer countries don't have the vaccines yet. Richer countries do. Now, it may so happen that the ironic result of lack of mobility, relative lack of mobility in a global economy, has actually helped spare those countries. We don't yet know why it is that, on the whole, the global south has suffered less than the global north from the pandemic. And even though people expected that the health infrastructures being much weaker would lead to, you know, much more devastating consequences in the countries of the global south. But the vaccine barriers are very much following a pattern that's antithetical to what the creation of the globalized economy and the World Trade Organization was supposed to be doing. So people are throwing up, you know, not tariff barriers, but when Italy stops a shipment of vaccine from going abroad, it's asserting that kind of nationalism and ensuring that the way in which the vaccine came prominently into Europe through Italy is now matched by the opposite. The virus invaded and the vaccine is being kept in. So there's that kind of dialectic between the mobility of the virus and the mobility of the vaccine. But in a sort of more political economy way, it's interesting that these variants are being described in relation to vaccination. I mean, that is, when do we care about a variant? when it appears to resist a vaccine. So it's almost like the vaccine has become a kind of line of defense. And if the virus attacks it, then it gets called a foreign invader. I mean, so not, I mean, so, you know, the invasive agent is like the one that breaks into the partial monopolistic systems that have been created by the vaccines, in a sense, that the viruses are only deemed worthy of attention if they're invading against the new political economic map created by the vaccines. And if, you know, so side by side with the dangerous strains are also stories about, well, it seems that Pfizer can guard against this or that kind of mutation, but not those other kinds. And, you know, will the vaccines be tweakable such that they can do these things in spite of the fact that it's a new strain? Discursively, it's interesting that nothing of the xenophobic charge that accompanied the initial label of the vaccine as a China virus or Wuhan virus accompanies the UK variant or the South African variant. I mean, these are taken almost as, oh, well, these are geopolitical terms. I mean, they're not going to provoke wars, although, you know, economic and trade restrictions maybe. So in what sense is the virus a bearer of desirable and undesirable foreignness? I mean, this is something that still is emergent. I don't know of an equivalent in this country to the Virusvariantengebiet that Germany has concocted as a geographical term. I mean, so there's sort of new geopolitical space being concocted in some places around this idea of the virus and the variant. These are just so much, I mean, like this is a development of the last 6 weeks. And, you know, for me to say I already have it analyzed and packaged and put away would be, you know, hubristic in the utmost. But sort of phenomenologically, what am I seeing? And the fact that the viruses are now being classified in relation to an extant geopolitics of vaccines, which exacerbate some of the divisions in the world, that I think is an interesting phenomenon.
Right. Well, related to this, I mean, of course, I mean, as you said, we are still grappling with this entire discourse of how the vaccine is kind of, you know, the geopolitics around the vaccine, to put it that way. But let me ask you the last question before we open the house for further discussion with our listeners. Many countries, you know, Germany and China, in fact, has already declared that, you know, they will introduce the vaccine passport. So, so that kind of, is this an imposition? And it kind of raises several questions regarding, you know, the moral compass and the ethical questions regarding the right to privacy and stuff like that. If you impose a vaccine passport to enter one country. So do you think that, you know, these vaccine passports will become very popular among the nation states in the days to come? And if so, then, you know, what kind of repercussions are we looking at? And how does that impact the geopolitics in the next few years to come in terms of mobility, especially?
And again, a very interesting set of questions. Now, I am old enough to have lived through an era when, in effect, I was required to have a vaccination passport already, so it's not new. No, it used to be that if you had been in certain, visited some regions of the world, and then you wanted to go to other regions, you had to carry this health thing certifying that you had been vaccinated. And since I was going back and forth between the US and India at that stage in my life, this yellow passport that I carried around with my other passport was a phenomenon of my life. So I don't find this new. But with any passport, all social theory focuses on the two-faced character of the thing. On the one hand, it increases mobility because it allows you to go past barriers. On the other hand, you're always giving up something. So let me be highly autobiographical for a moment. I left India in 1956, and I became an American citizen in 1987. You can do the arithmetic. I had been living in America with a small sojourn in Germany in the intervening 31 years and had not traveled without my Indian passport. But in 1986, Germany erected barriers and made it no longer possible. So was it 86 or 82 already, I think. Before that, Germany had accepted Indians without any passport needed at the border. But that one of those early 1980s years was when that was removed and restrictions became commonplace. And so for me, the choice to become an American citizen was motivated, at least in part, in important part, because I wanted to retain my freedom as a researcher. And it was becoming virtually impossible without the American passport. So the passport for me enabled me to have a kind of mobility that I, simply as born in the global South, could not have had otherwise. And I think that with the vaccine passport, it's going to be a similar sort of thing. Who has access to getting such a passport in the first place? Who benefits from the mobility in the first place? I mean, it's not, one other anecdote you might be interested in is that, at the Kennedy School, we have a lot of politicians who are cycling out of politics and then they'd like to come and spend a year at Harvard or a couple of years at Harvard. And we had a major American political figure from Congress, I won't describe this any further, who came and stayed with us sort of at the turn of the century. And he said that in the US Congress, it was actually a badge of honor not to have a passport, because passports were associated with foreign junkets, people going abroad and enjoying their trips abroad, and it was felt that they were no longer working for their constituencies back home. And in the red Midwestern belt, it was actually considered a badge of honor that you did not have a passport. So that, again, that kind of thing brings home the sort of embeddedness of passports in a political culture, in an entire set of assumptions about, is this an enabling document or a constraining document? And for any sort of constitutional law thinker, as I consider myself in part, it's never either or. So the questions then shift ground to the who, why, what for, the purposive questions, the power questions, and not a straight out, is it this or is it that? So that's how I see this emergence of the vaccine passport, an old thing in my life being resurrected in a new context, but very much part of the dynamic of the sort of global winning and losing, the global who gets to be mobile and dictate the terms of their own mobility. I mean, I think that's a way to put it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Resurrection of the medical passport and whether it's going to be enabling or restraining. Fascinating to hear you, Professor Jasanoff. I could actually continue talking to you all day, honestly, but we will have to come to a stop formally. But I think we really are in a very interesting situation that we're talking so much about passport, vaccine passport, and all these things, but not all countries and not all the people in the world are also receiving the vaccine uniformly, to the extent that yesterday I read an article in Middle East Eye that are we reaching a space called vaccine appetite? Is this the new phenomena around? So there's different conversations going around, and given the geopolitical conditions of existence, all it is unfortunate, but we are not surprised that there is a big difference in terms of who's getting the vaccines and who are not getting the vaccines. So the simple and but worrisome question with which I would like to formally close this conversation before we open the house is, will the vaccine heal the world, or will it take us to a dystopic future where vaccine pass will become mandatory for access to resources? I agree that it has happened before, but when it resurrects, what will that mean for people who are already subject to multiple challenges due to race, gender, class positions? What will this mean for the refugees and irregular migrants who are already, very likely to face several obstacles in mobility in a post-pandemic future? So these are the questions which will keep looming large, and maybe in the next few months to come, we will have some answer to these questions. So I'll stop here now.